3 days after burying my husband, a stranger claiming to be his landlord called me. He spoke in a terrified whisper, demanding I come over immediately and explicitly warning me not to tell my sister. Before I could even ask why, he dropped a sentence that made my blood run cold. He said he had just opened the secret room my husband rented, and found something inside that could not possibly exist if he were truly dead. My name is Olivia Harper. I am 36 years old, and exactly 3 days ago, I buried my husband. They called it a tragic accident, a localized electrical fault in a self-storage facility on the edge of town. The official report stated that Gideon Harper had been caught in a flashover, a sudden, explosive consumption of oxygen and material that left nothing behind but charred beams and ash. The police closed the case in less than 48 hours. I spent the next 72 hours moving like a ghost through a house that suddenly felt entirely too large, breathing in the silence he left behind. Then the phone rang. The voice on the other end was reedy, tight with an anxiety that bled right through the receiver. It belonged to a man named Miles Rourke. He introduced himself as a commercial property manager for a dilapidated brick building on the south side. He was calling about my husband's lease. I sat perfectly still on the edge of our unmade bed. I told him he had to be mistaken. Gideon was a forensic accountant. He worked from his firm downtown or from his study down the hall. He did not rent a secondary office. Miles Rourke cut me off. He told me I needed to come down there immediately. His breath hitched as he added a warning that made the hairs on my arms stand up. He told me not to tell my sister. Marin, I asked him why on earth I would mention a commercial lease to my sister. Miles lowered his voice to a terrified whisper. He said someone had just come to his management office asking very specific, aggressive questions about Gideon's workspace, demanding access. The man had threatened to bring the police if Miles did not hand over the keys. Miles knew the man's name because the man had slapped a business card on the counter. It was Beckett Cross, Marin's fiancé. The numbness that had blanketed my brain since the funeral shattered instantly. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the door without locking it. The drive across town felt like a fever dream. The sky was an oppressive, heavy gray, and the rain lashed against the windshield in angry bursts. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Gideon and I shared everything. We shared bank accounts, passwords, fears, and futures. The idea that he had a secret office he paid for in cash, a place Beckett Cross somehow knew about while I remained completely in the dark, gnawed at my sanity. The building was a decaying industrial relic sandwiched between a tire shop and an abandoned textile mill. The management office was a cramped, poorly lit room on the ground floor. The moment I pushed the heavy glass door open, it hit me. Cedarwood oil. It was a sharp, earthy scent, undeniably distinct. It was the exact custom-blended beard oil Gideon applied every single morning. The scent was not faint. It hung thick and heavy in the stagnant air of the lobby, as if he had just walked right past me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a desperate bird trapped in a cage of bone. Miles Rourke was a small, nervous man with thinning hair and a sheen of cold sweat on his forehead. He practically locked the door behind me. Without wasting a single breath on condolences, he reached into his desk drawer and placed a thick, heavy manila envelope on the scarred wooden surface between us. The flap was sealed with dark red wax. Gideon's handwriting scrawled across the front in thick black ink. It was my name. Miles looked at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. He said Gideon had come in 2 weeks ago, paid 6 months of rent in crisp $100 bills, and handed him that envelope. Gideon's instructions were absolute. If anything happened to him, Miles was to give it to me, and only to me. He was to trust absolutely no one else, especially not anyone claiming to be family. I reached for the envelope, my fingers trembling, but Miles placed his hand over it. He said there was something else I needed to see first. He slid a grainy, black and white printout across the desk. It was a screenshot from the hallway security camera, aimed directly at the door of Unit 3B. The timestamp in the bottom right corner read 2:14 in the morning. The date was yesterday, exactly 2 days after Gideon supposedly burned to death in a storage unit. The image showed a figure stepping out of Unit 3B. The person wore a heavy dark hoodie pulled low, obscuring the face entirely, but the body language screamed at me. The broad shoulders, the slight, almost imperceptible shift of weight to the left leg. A lingering habit from a college hockey injury 15 years ago. It was a gait I had watched walk away from me 1,000 times. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my hand to my mouth, suffocating a sob. It was him. It had to be him. Miles leaned closer, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. He swallowed hard. He whispered that the camera only captured motion when someone entered or exited. He said the footage from 2:14 in the morning was shocking enough. But then he went upstairs to check the perimeter after Beckett Cross left his office an hour ago. Miles looked me dead in the eye. He said he found wet mud on the hallway runner. He said there were fresh signs that someone had been inside that room just hours ago. Today. I snatched the envelope from the desk and demanded he take me to the room. We climbed 2 flights of rickety wooden stairs in total silence. The scent of cedarwood grew stronger with every step, twisting my stomach into tight, agonizing knots. The hallway on the 3rd floor was dim, illuminated by a single flickering fluorescent bulb. At the very end of the corridor stood a heavy reinforced metal door. Unit 3B. Miles stopped 10 feet away. He handed me a single brass key. His hand shook violently. He whispered that he was not going any closer, turned around, and practically ran back down the stairs. I was entirely alone. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. I walked toward the metal door, my mind fractured into a dozen different terrifying possibilities. If Gideon was dead, who was the man in the video? Why was Beckett Cross looking for this place? What did my sister have to do with any of this? And if Gideon was alive, why had he let me bury a box of ashes? I stopped in front of the door. The brass key felt like a block of ice in my palm. I raised my hand. Inserting the key into the deadbolt, I took a deep, shuddering breath, preparing to turn it and uncover whatever secrets my husband had hidden in the dark. Then, I froze. Before I could apply an ounce of pressure to the key, the heavy deadbolt on the other side of the metal door slid back with a loud, metallic click. Someone was inside, and they were opening the door. The memory of the funeral rushed back to me, an overwhelming tide of wrongness that had culminated in this exact, terrifying moment. The day we buried Gideon was a masterclass in performative mourning, a suburban theater of hushed voices and black umbrellas. The heavy, sickeningly sweet scent of dying lilies and damp earth clung to the humid afternoon air. Marin arrived exactly 20 minutes late to the graveside service. She walked across the manicured cemetery grass with the poise of a runway model, wearing a tailored black sheath dress that belonged at an upscale Manhattan cocktail party, not a burial. Her eyes were completely dry, her mascara pristine and undisturbed by even a hint of unshed tears, but her body language betrayed her. She gripped her black leather clutch with a white-knuckled ferocity, her tendons visibly straining against her pale skin. She looked less like a grieving sister and more like a woman desperately trying to suppress a violent panic attack. Beckett Cross played his assigned role flawlessly. He hovered at her side, the very picture of the strong, supportive future brother-in-law. He kept a steadying hand resting perfectly on Marin's lower back, offering rehearsed, somber nods to our extended family members. But as the afternoon wore on, I noticed a distinct, calculated pattern to his movements. Whenever an older aunt or uncle approached to offer condolences and inevitably shifted the conversation toward the harsh, logistical realities of sudden death, probate court, life insurance policies, the mortgage payments, Beckett would smoothly and surgically intervene. He would offer a sad, apologetic smile, gently take Marin by the elbow, and steer her away, whispering that they needed to get some fresh air. He was systematically isolating her from any conversation that involved money or legal paperwork. This bizarre, orchestrated behavior reached its peak during the reception at my house later that evening. The living room was packed with people speaking in muted, pitiful tones, picking aimlessly at dry deli platters and stale potato salad. I was standing alone by the kitchen island, staring blankly at the dark surface of cold coffee in my mug, when Beckett slid into the empty space beside me. He did not offer a hug. He did not ask how I was holding up or if I needed a glass of water. Instead, he leaned in close and asked a question so profoundly inappropriate that the two neighbors standing nearby suddenly became incredibly fascinated by the texture of their paper napkins, pretending they had not heard a single word. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial murmur and asked, "Olivia, I know this is a terrible time to bring this up, but we need to think practically. Did Gideon leave any joint accounts or a financial power of attorney? You need to locate those documents before the state steps in." I just stared at him, my brain too exhausted by grief to muster the righteous anger he deserved. Who interrogates a widow about a power of attorney before the funeral guests have even finished their lukewarm ziti? That night, long after the house had finally emptied of the hollow sympathies, I sat alone at the dining room table with the heavy manila evidence bag the local police department had handed over. It contained the few personal items recovered from Gideon's body before the fire had consumed the rest of the storage facility. I dumped the contents onto the wood surface: his stainless steel watch with the cracked face, his scorched leather wallet. I opened the wallet, my fingers tracing the soot-stained, brittle edges of the leather. Instantly, I realized something was missing: his everyday keychain, the heavy brass ring that held our front door key. The mailbox key, and his silver car fob, was completely gone. The police investigator had told me the fire burned incredibly hot, but solid brass and steel do not simply evaporate into thin air. In the small interior pocket where he usually tucked his emergency $20 bills, I found something else. It was a small, thick piece of torn white cardstock. It was slightly charred at the top corner, but the heavy black ink was unmistakably Gideon's neat, block handwriting. It simply read, "Rourke, Unit 3B." The days immediately following the funeral brought a new, distinct kind of suffocation. Marin, who usually kept our sisterly interactions limited to brief phone calls and obligatory holiday dinners, suddenly became an inescapable shadow. She showed up unannounced every single morning with foil-covered casseroles and aggressively bright smiles. She practically demanded to sleep in my guest room, claiming it was dangerous and unhealthy for me to be alone in such a big, empty house. "You are in shock, Liv," she kept saying, pouring my morning coffee and physically taking my car keys away from the kitchen counter. "I absolutely do not want you driving anywhere by yourself. Just rest on the couch. Let us handle the outside world." On the surface, to any outside observer, it looked like the ultimate act of selfless familial devotion, but beneath the veneer of baked goods and herbal tea, I felt a creeping, icy sensation crawling up my spine. Her eyes tracked my every movement with a predatory intensity. If I picked up my phone to check an email, she casually asked who I was texting. If I walked toward Gideon's home office, she suddenly needed my urgent help finding something in the kitchen. The relentless care she provided felt less like comforting love and distinctly more like active surveillance. She was not protecting me. She was making sure I stayed exactly where she could see me, boxed inside my own living room. That creeping paranoia might have remained easily dismissed as a byproduct of my shattered emotional state, if not for a brief, chilling conversation with Susan, my elderly neighbor from across the street. 2 days after the funeral, Susan waddled over with a box of bakery pastries. She lingered nervously on the porch, looking over her shoulder before leaning in uncomfortably close to my ear. She whispered that she did not want to add to my nightmares, but she felt I needed to know what she saw. The night before, around 2 a.m, her dog had needed to go out. While standing on her front lawn, she looked across the dark street. She saw Beckett cross. He was not walking up to my door to check on me. He was just standing on the sidewalk, cloaked in the heavy shadows of the large oak tree, staring unblinkingly at my dark house. Susan said he stood perfectly still in the freezing air for nearly 45 minutes, smoking one cigarette after another, looking exactly like a man standing guard. waiting for someone to make a move. I had thanked Susan, locked the heavy front door behind her, and slid down the wall until I hit the cold hardwood floor. I desperately tried to rationalize it all. I told myself it was just the chaotic, messy reality of a grieving family. Grief makes normal people behave erratically. Maren was just being overprotective because she did not know how else to help. Beckett was just a bizarrely practical, socially awkward man dealing with insomnia. But my stomach curled into a tight, sick knot, violently rejecting every logical excuse my desperate brain tried to formulate. My gut knew something was catastrophically wrong long before the landlord ever called. Sitting there on the floor, staring down the empty, silent hallway of my home, a single memory had surfaced with terrifying clarity. It was a brief conversation from 3 weeks before Gideon died. We had been sitting at the kitchen island late at night. He had been unusually quiet, staring intensely into his mug as if trying to decipher the future in the dark liquid. Out of nowhere, he reached across the granite counter, gripped my hand hard enough to bruise, and looked me dead in the eye with a cold, terrifying sincerity. His voice was completely devoid of its usual warmth. He said, "Liv, listen to me very carefully. If I ever disappear, do not trust the person who loves you the most." The sharp, metallic click that had nearly stopped my heart was nothing more than the heavy, rusted tumblers of the deadbolt finally giving way under the pressure of my trembling hand. There was no one waiting in the dark to ambush me. I pushed the heavy steel door open, and the fluorescent strip lights overhead flickered to life with a low, electric hum. Miles Rourke, who had not actually run all the way down to the lobby, crept back up the stairs and hovered anxiously in the doorframe, his breath shallow and ragged. I stepped over the threshold and felt the air rush out of my lungs. If there had been any tiny, cynical part of my brain bracing to find a hidden apartment reeking of cheap perfume, a secondary life built for an affair, that fear was instantly obliterated. This was not a sanctuary for a mistress. It was a war room. The walls were plastered with massive corkboards, completely covered in topographical maps, printed emails, highlighted bank statements, and dense timelines connected by taut strings of red yarn. Stacks of file boxes lined the baseboards, all meticulously labeled in Gideon's sharp handwriting. The large mahogany desk in the center of the room was buried under mountains of legal documents. It looked exactly like the staging ground for a federal investigation. I walked slowly toward the desk, my eyes scanning the chaotic but structured mess. Dead center on the leather blotter rested a single, thick manila folder. The label printed across the top tab read, "Harper Ridge, Mineral Easement and Title." My hands began to shake violently as I opened the cover. Harper Ridge was a barren, rocky expanse of exactly 50 acres in the northern county. Our late father had left it to Maren and me when he passed away nearly 7 years ago. For the last 5 years, Maren had relentlessly complained about the property taxes, insisting the land was practically worthless dirt and dry brush. A financial burden we should just surrender to the county. But as I flipped through the pages in Gideon's file, a terrifying new reality emerged. There were recent geological surveys, private land appraisals, and heavily guarded drilling prospectuses. The land was not worthless. It was sitting directly on top of a massive, highly lucrative deposit of natural gas and rare minerals. It was a literal gold mine, and corporate entities were quietly preparing to pay millions for the extraction rights. Miles cleared his throat from the doorway, making me jump. He wrung his hands together, his eyes darting around the manicured chaos of the walls. He told me that exactly 14 days ago, Gideon had brought in a private contractor to install a high-security lock on the door. Gideon had handed Miles a sealed envelope containing $2,000 in crisp, untraceable cash. Miles said Gideon looked utterly exhausted, like a man who had not slept in a month. When he handed over the money, Gideon had looked Miles dead in the eye and delivered a chilling instruction. He said that if he ended up dead, Miles was to ensure that absolutely no member of his wife's family ever crossed that threshold. I turned my attention back to the desk, my vision blurring with a mixture of profound shock and rising adrenaline. tucked beneath the geological surveys. I found a stapled legal document. It was a photocopied quitclaim deed and an irrevocable power of attorney agreement, essentially surrendering all my legal rights to the Harper Ridge property over to a corporate holding company. My eyes dropped to the bottom of the fourth page. There, in bold blue ink, was my signature. I traced the curves of the letters with my index finger. It was a flawless, terrifyingly accurate forgery. I had never seen this document in my entire life, let alone signed it in front of the notary whose stamp graced the bottom corner. The date next to the forged signature was listed as exactly 2 months ago. Beside the fraudulent deed sat a heavy-duty, waterproof plastic pouch. Inside the clear casing was a sleek silver USB thumb drive. Written across the plastic exterior in thick black permanent marker were 2 simple words: "Only Olivia." Miles stepped a few inches further into the room, his voice dropping into a frantic whisper. He finally explained exactly why he had been so terrified to call me. When Beckett Cross had barged into the management office that morning, he had not just politely asked for access to my husband's workspace. Beckett had slammed a stack of $100 bills onto the counter, attempting a blatant bribe. When Miles refused, terrified of Gideon's previous warning, Beckett turned vicious. He threatened to bury the management company in endless, bankrupting litigation for illegal retention of property, claiming he was acting on behalf of the grieving family. Beckett was absolutely desperate to get inside this room and destroy this evidence before I even knew it existed. Standing in the center of that cramped, cedar-scented room, the suffocating fog of grief that had paralyzed me since the funeral instantly evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, blinding clarity. Gideon had not been hiding a secret life from me. He had been building a fortress to protect me. He had discovered the rot growing inside my own bloodline, the elaborate, sickening scheme my sister and her fiancé had orchestrated to steal my inheritance and erase my rights. He had been compiling the evidence, preparing to blow their entire operation apart. I took a deep breath, rounding the desk to sit in Gideon's heavy leather chair. The chair creaked, a familiar, comforting sound. I ran my hands under the lip of the desk, my fingers brushing against the rough wood. Gideon had a lifelong habit of hiding emergency keys. My index finger caught on a piece of heavy tape. I peeled it back, freeing a tiny silver key. I slid the key into the lock of the center desk drawer. The mechanism turned smoothly. I pulled the heavy wooden drawer open. It was completely empty, save for a single piece of thick white cardstock resting alone in the dark shadows of the wood. I picked it up. Written in the center of the paper, in the steady, familiar handwriting of the man I had supposedly just buried, were 3 words: "I am not gone." I broke the dark red wax seal on the manila envelope, my thumbnail tearing through the thick paper with a harsh, jagged sound. The profound, paralyzing grief that had weighed down my bones for the past 3 days was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a strange, vibrating heat in my chest. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of yellow legal paper. I unfolded it. There were no poetic declarations of eternal devotion, no tender farewells, and absolutely no apologies for leaving me behind. It was written with the frantic, jagged strokes of a man running out of time. The ink was smeared in places, the sentences sharp and utterly devoid of emotion. Gideon wrote that for the past 6 months, he had been quietly tracking an aggressive, highly sophisticated land title fraud ring operating across 3 state lines. The criminals were targeting remote, high-value properties owned by elderly citizens or disconnected families, forging quitclaim deeds, and transferring the mineral rights into untraceable corporate holding accounts. Gideon had followed the money trail through a labyrinth of offshore LLCs and fake domestic brokerage firms. At the very center of the web, hiding behind a half-dozen proxy names and forged notary stamps, was Beckett Cross. My eyes darted across the yellow page, the words blurring as my pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my eardrums. Gideon detailed how Beckett was utilizing a shell company to prepare the ground for a massive corporate buyout of Harper Ridge. But Beckett had a significant problem. He could not legally execute the sale without my direct, uncontested authorization. He needed me to sign away my birthright voluntarily, or at least appear to do so on a legally binding document. Then, I reached the paragraph that finally broke my heart, cleanly and violently. Gideon wrote that Marin was not an innocent bystander caught in her fiancé's web. He suspected she might not know the full, violent extent of Beckett's criminal enterprise. But she absolutely knew the ultimate goal. She knew Beckett was actively targeting me. She knew the land was worth millions, and she was actively conspiring to manipulate me into signing the power of attorney. I read his final warning 3 times, the syllables burning themselves into my memory. He wrote that the moment he was out of the picture, they would descend on me. He warned that I would be approached with warm food, suffocating pity, and the weaponized use of the word family. He explicitly instructed me not to sign a single piece of paper, no matter how overwhelmed or exhausted they made me feel. I dropped the letter onto the leather desk blotter. My hands were shaking, but not from sorrow. It was pure, unadulterated rage. The memory of my sister forcing me to eat her homemade casseroles, her vigilant, suffocating presence in my living room, her desperate attempts to keep me isolated under the guise of sisterly protection. It was all a calculated, predatory performance. They were treating me like livestock, fattening me up with fake sympathy before leading me to the slaughterhouse. I grabbed the heavy waterproof pouch sitting next to the forged deed. I ripped the plastic open and pulled out the sleek silver USB drive. There was an older model laptop sitting on the corner of the mahogany desk, its lid closed and gathering a thin layer of dust. I flipped it open, pressed the power button, and waited an agonizing 2 minutes for the operating system to boot up. The screen glowed with a harsh, bluish light. I jammed the drive into the side port. A single video file popped up on the desktop. I clicked play. Gideon's face filled the screen. The video had clearly been recorded using the terrible built-in webcam of a cheap phone. The lighting was poor, casting deep, hollow shadows under his eyes. He looked completely wrecked. His skin was pale, his hair was unkempt, and he possessed the frantic, wired energy of an animal backed into a corner. He stared directly into the lens, his voice a harsh, grating whisper. He stated that if I was watching this recording, it meant they had finally made their move. I leaned closer to the screen, desperate for a sign, for a clear explanation of what had happened in that storage facility. But the video offered no confirmation of life or death. He did not explain the fire. He did not tell me where he was or if the charred remains I had buried were actually his. He simply took a deep, ragged breath and said he had prepared a way to bring every single one of them out of the shadows and into the blinding light. He told me to trust the timeline, to hold my ground, and to wait for contact. Then, the screen cut to black. I stared at my dark reflection in the glossy monitor, my mind spinning violently. Before I could even process his cryptic message, a sharp, electronic buzzing shattered the silence in the room. I spun around. Miles Rourke was standing near the doorframe, fumbling desperately in the pocket of his trousers. He pulled out his cell phone. The screen illuminated his pale, terrified face. It was an unknown number calling. But that was not what made his jaw drop. His thumb swiped across the screen, pulling up the live feed from his building's security cameras. All the blood drained from Miles's face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He whispered that Beckett was standing in the lobby downstairs. My stomach plummeted. I slammed the laptop shut, yanking the USB drive from the port and shoving it deep into the front pocket of my jeans. I grabbed Gideon's yellow letter, folding it haphazardly and stuffing it into the same pocket. I moved with a sudden, predatory grace I did not know I possessed. I crossed the room in 3 large strides and hit the heavy plastic switch on the wall, plunging the entire office into total, suffocating darkness. I grabbed Miles by the forearm, my grip bruising his skin, and dragged him away from the doorframe. We pressed our backs flat against the cold brick wall beside the heavy metal door. I clamped my hand over my own mouth, forcing my erratic breathing to slow down. For a terrifying, agonizing minute, there was nothing but the sound of my own pulse hammering in my ears. Then, I heard it, the heavy, rhythmic thud of leather dress shoes ascending the wooden staircase. The steps were slow, deliberate, and carried the arrogant weight of a man who believed he owned the world. The footsteps reached the third-floor landing and paused. I could hear the faint, sickening sound of leather gloves stretching. A voice echoed through the thin gap beneath the metal door. Slightly muffled but unmistakably clear. It was Beckett. He was not speaking to us. He was speaking to someone on the phone. His tone was a chilling mixture of cold calculation and rising frustration. I squeezed my eyes shut as his words drifted through the steel barrier, freezing the blood in my veins. He told the person on the other end of the line that she absolutely had to sign the documents by the end of the week. He paused for a moment, listening to a response I could not hear. Then, his voice dropped an octave, dripping with a quiet, lethal malice. He stated that if she refused to sign, the plan had to change. The drive back from the industrial park took nearly a full hour. My hands vibrated against the leather steering wheel, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated rage. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked fundamentally different to me. It was no longer a sanctuary of shared memories. It was a brightly lit stage. And I was stepping into the most critical performance of my entire life. I unlocked the front door and immediately forced my spine to curve. Letting my shoulders slump forward, I adopted the exact physical posture Gideon had predicted they would expect. I became a woman entirely broken by tragedy, a widow incapable of navigating the basic functions of daily life. I walked into the kitchen, desperately craving the mindless, grounding routine of boiling water for tea. I reached into the deep pantry for a heavy ceramic flour canister, intending to move it aside to reach the loose chamomile. My knuckles brushed against the row of glass spice jars. I knocked over a small bottle of ground cloves, sending it clattering against the wooden shelf. When I bent down to pick it up, my breath caught in my throat. Tucked perfectly in the dark recess behind the heavy canister, fixed to the wood with a small square of adhesive, was a matte black disc. It was no larger than a silver dollar coin, a listening device, a tiny battery-operated microphone planted directly in the heart of my home. My instinct screamed at me to rip it off the shelf and smash it with a heavy cast iron pan, but I forced my hand to smoothly pick up the spilled cloves, set the bottle upright, and step away. I left the bug exactly where it was. If they wanted to listen to a shattered, weeping woman shuffling aimlessly around her kitchen, I would give them a flawless, award-winning performance. Less than 45 minutes later, the heavy brass knocker on the front door echoed through the hallway. I splashed cold water on my face, making sure my eyes remained red and heavily puffed, and slowly opened the door. Marin and Beckett stood on the front porch. Marin held an expensive bakery box tied with pristine white string. Beckett held his sleek, black leather briefcase. They ushered themselves inside without waiting for an invitation, wrapping me in a suffocating cloud of synthetic vanilla perfume and sharp, aggressive cologne. Marin guided me to the living room sofa with exaggerated, theatrical gentleness, treating me as if I were made of cracked porcelain. Beckett, however, did not sit down immediately. He paced the perimeter of the room with slow, deliberate steps. His eyes swept over the antique clock on the mantel, the expensive artwork Gideon had purchased last year, and the state-of-the-art television mounted on the wall. He was not looking at a grieving household. He was mentally taking inventory of my assets. Finally, Beckett took a seat in the armchair directly opposite the sofa. He crossed his legs, resting his hands neatly on his knees. He adopted a tone of hushed, practiced sympathy. He began his pitch smoothly, weaving his true intentions through layers of fake apologies for bringing up legal business at such a terrible time. He explained that probate court was an absolute nightmare, and that vulnerable widows were routinely targeted and taken advantage of by aggressive creditors and ruthless state tax agencies. Then, He offered his grand solution. He would manage absolutely everything. He would handle the life insurance policies, the mortgage transfers, and the vehicular titles. With a casualness that made my skin crawl. He shifted the topic to Harper Ridge. He called our family land a barren rock, a massive tax liability that would ultimately drag down my financial future. He generously offered to wrap the property up into a corporate holding trust he managed, simply to take the heavy administrative burden off my shoulders. It sounded incredibly logical. To an uninformed observer, it sounded like an act of profound, selfless kindness. Marin leaned in close, taking both of my hands in hers. Her grip was tight, bordering on painful. She looked at me with wide, desperately sympathetic eyes. "You cannot do this alone, Liv," she whispered, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "You are just too fragile right now. Let us handle the outside world. I just want you safe." The word family hung in the stagnant air between us, a poisonous barb wrapped entirely in silk. I lowered my head, letting a convincing, heavy tear slip down my cheek. I sniffled, playing the naive, overwhelmed victim to absolute perfection. I looked up at Beckett with wide, innocent eyes and asked what exactly I needed to do to achieve this safety. I asked what I needed to sign. The speed of Beckett's reaction was genuinely startling. The heavy brass locks on his briefcase clicked open in a fraction of a second. He produced a thick stack of stapled legal documents and a heavy silver fountain pen, sliding them rapidly across the glass coffee table toward me. He pointed a manicured finger to a yellow sticky note marking the bottom of the third page. I reached forward. I let my trembling fingers brush the cool metal of the pen. Then, I stopped. I pulled my hand back sharply and wrapped my arms around my torso, rocking slightly on the cushions. "I cannot sign this yet," I whispered, my voice thick with fake tears. "I want to read it carefully, every single word. Gideon always told me to do that." The muscles in Beckett's jaw clenched so hard, I thought his teeth might crack. A brief, terrifying flash of genuine, predatory anger crossed his perfectly symmetrical face. Marin immediately tried to intervene, her voice rising a full octave as she insisted that Beckett was a seasoned professional and I was deeply insulting him by hesitating. But I held my ground. I cried harder, burying my face in my hands, sobbing loudly that I just wanted to honor my dead husband's wishes. They could not force the pen into my hand without completely breaking the illusion of their benevolence. Reluctantly, Beckett snatched the papers off the table and shoved them back into his briefcase, his smile tight and utterly devoid of warmth. 10 minutes after they finally walked out the front door, leaving a suffocating, tense silence in their wake. My cell phone vibrated deep in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a secure text message from an old colleague at the Brightwell Compliance Group, the corporate firm where I had worked for the past 7 years. The message was brief and terrifying. My colleague wrote that an unidentified man had just called the main reception desk. The caller had aggressively demanded to know my exact work schedule, asking precisely which days I would be returning to the building and what time my shifts ended. I stood completely alone in the center of the living room, staring at the empty space where Beckett had sat just moments before. The cold, hard truth settled over my shoulders like a heavy lead blanket. They were not offering me a lifeline to pull me out of the dark. They were systematically closing every single exit, the hidden microphone in my kitchen, the constant, suffocating visits, the urgent push for my legal signature, and now, the active surveillance of my daily movements. I understood exactly what they were doing. They were carefully constructing a cage around me, building bars forged from fake sympathy and complex legal jargon, just waiting patiently for me to blindly step inside. I waited until midnight. I left my primary cell phone resting casually on the kitchen counter, directly adjacent to the hidden microphone behind the flour canister, playing the faint sound of a late-night television talk show to maintain the illusion of my presence. I slipped out the back door, walked 3 blocks in the freezing rain, and paid a cab driver in cash to drop me 2 streets away from the industrial park. Miles Rourke was nowhere to be seen when I let myself into the damp building and crept up the darkened stairs to Unit 3B. Once the heavy metal door clicked shut, locking me inside the cedar-scented room, I pulled the thick white cardstock from my pocket. On the reverse side of the card, directly beneath the words that had completely shattered my grief, was a 10-digit phone number written in faint pencil. I pulled open the heavy wooden desk drawer again, pushed all the way to the back. Hidden in the shadows sat a cheap, prepaid plastic cell phone. My fingers felt entirely numb as I punched in the numbers. I pressed the cold plastic speaker to my ear. The line rang exactly twice. A sharp click echoed through the receiver. "Liv, do not panic." The voice was ragged, laced with a harsh, gravelly exhaustion, but the cadence was a melody I had memorized over a decade. I sank to my knees on the dirty linoleum floor, a violent sob tearing through my throat. I pressed both hands hard over my mouth to muffle the sound. My chest heaving uncontrollably. It was Gideon. He told me to breathe, to stay perfectly silent, and just listen. He explained that the fire at the storage facility was not a tragic accident. He had known for weeks that Beckett was getting desperate, so he had rented a decoy unit and filled it with useless, heavily redacted tax files. When the flashover happened, Gideon was already 2 buildings away, watching the flames consume the trap he had laid. He had to let the world, and more importantly, Beckett, believe the assassination attempt had been completely successful. It was the only way to force them out of hiding. Gideon's voice dropped to a rapid, clinical whisper. He explained that he could not simply walk into the local police precinct and declare himself alive. The corruption ran entirely too deep. Beckett's shell company was not operating in a vacuum. He had successfully bought off a crucial link inside the county clerk's office, an official who rubber-stamped the forged titles and actively expedited the fraudulent transfers while deliberately blinding the local authorities. That was exactly why Gideon had bypassed local law enforcement entirely. For the past several days, he had been operating from a secure, windowless motel room across the state border. He was working directly with a woman named Investigator Dana Klein. She was a senior operative for the State Financial Crimes Division, and she had been aggressively building a massive, sprawling title fraud case against Beckett for nearly 2 years. A new voice took over the call. It was Dana Klein. Her tone was sharp, professional, and entirely devoid of warmth. She confirmed that her team had enough paper trails, forged notary stamps, and offshore wire transfers to put Beckett in a federal penitentiary for decades. But there was a massive, glaring problem. They had absolutely nothing concrete on Marin. Marin had kept her hands impeccably clean. Her signature was nowhere on the fraudulent documents. There were no traceable bank transfers in her name, no text messages linking her to the county clerk or the arsonist. If the state brought the hammer down right now, Beckett would take the fall, and Marin would play the traumatized, deceived sister. She would walk away completely untouched. Dana stated clearly that to legally bind my sister to the conspiracy, they needed a recorded, undeniable verbal admission that she fully knew about the forged paperwork and the plot to coerce my signature. Gideon came back on the line to outline the counteroffensive. Dana's unit had quietly commandeered a vacant commercial office suite downtown. By tomorrow morning, it would be fully dressed as a high-end, boutique law firm operating under the fictional name Holloway and Pierce Legal. The conference room was already heavily wired with hidden, legally sanctioned audio and video recording equipment. My assignment was brutal but simple. I had to call Marin and tell her I was ready to surrender. I had to tell her I was completely exhausted, entirely broken, and willing to sign away the land just to make the nightmare stop. I would insist on doing it at my own supposedly independent legal office for my own peace of mind. Gideon promised that the sheer relief of finally securing the signature would completely blind them to the trap. I just had to sit at that mahogany table, play the devastated widow, and push Marin into verbally confirming her active role in the extortion. I gripped the plastic phone tight enough to crack the casing, staring blankly at the wall of chaotic evidence in front of me. I asked Gideon why Marin would go to such extreme, violent lengths just to get her hands on the money. We were family. We had shared a bedroom for 15 years. The silence on the line stretched out for 10 agonizing seconds. When Gideon finally spoke again, the sheer, icy dread in his voice made the blood freeze in my veins. He told me I was fundamentally misunderstanding the entire scope of their operation. He said they did not just want the land or the mineral rights. He told me to look at the paperwork again. Gideon took a shallow, shaking breath. They do not just want the land. Live. They want you erased from the line of inheritance. Completely. I returned home just before dawn, exhausted but buzzing with a dangerous new energy. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the sound of heavy rolling luggage in the hallway startled me awake. I walked out of my bedroom to find Maren standing by the staircase. She had 2 massive hard-shell suitcases beside her. She flashed her old, perfectly practiced smile, but her eyes were entirely different. They looked exactly like the heavy steel deadbolts on a prison door. She announced she was moving in temporarily. She even jingled a brand new, shiny brass house key she had somehow copied without my permission. She said she could not bear the thought of me being completely alone in this big, empty house. The invasion was rapid and entirely suffocating. Within 2 hours, Beckett arrived holding a power drill and 3 heavy cardboard boxes. He claimed the neighborhood had experienced a string of recent burglaries, so he was installing high-definition security cameras in the hallway, the kitchen, and the living room. He insisted it was solely for my physical protection. In reality, they were building a digital cage to monitor my every move. Then came the micromanagement, meticulously disguised as profound familial care. Maren gently confiscated my car keys, placing them high on a kitchen cabinet shelf, insisting my overwhelming grief made me a hazard on the road. Beckett smoothly took my cell phone, claiming he had merged my account with theirs to save me $75 a month, handing it back with a subtle location tracking application installed. He even took my laptop into the dining room, claiming he needed to run a deep virus sweep because foreign hackers always targeted recent widows. I was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a brightly lit glass cage inside my own living room. I survived the suffocating pressure cooker of my own home by relying entirely on 2 things. The first was my sharpened ability to observe everything while pretending to notice absolutely nothing. The second was a sleek, matte black digital voice recorder Gideon had instructed me to take from the bottom drawer of his secret desk before I left the industrial park. Dana Klein had supplied it to him weeks ago. It was completely untraceable, and I kept it taped securely flat against my ribcage beneath my oversized wool sweater. I silently recorded every single interaction, every fake apology, and every passive-aggressive command they issued. As the hours dragged on, Maren's flawless mask of sisterly devotion began to crack under the severe strain of our shared proximity. The old, ugly resentments she had harbored since our childhood started bleeding directly into her casual conversations, while aggressively scrubbing the perfectly clean kitchen counter. She muttered that I was always the one who got the easy path. She practically spat the words, saying I was always our father's chosen one. The golden child who received the prime inheritance while she was left with nothing but scraps. It became sickeningly clear that her presence here was not just about securing the financial bag. This entire funeral was merely a convenient opening act for a bitter, decades-old rivalry she was finally ready to win. Beckett made his first critical error during dinner that evening. While casually pushing a plate of roasted chicken toward me, he sighed heavily and mentioned that I really needed to let go of Harper Ridge. He said the soil was far too acidic, and the deep shale formations underneath made the land entirely useless for anything but a corporate tax write-off. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. The deep shale formations were a highly classified geological detail found only in the stolen private survey reports sitting in Gideon's secret office. A normal, grieving brother-in-law would never know that specific terminology. I kept my face entirely blank, committing his exact words to memory, recognizing it as the perfect bait for the trap we were building. Later that evening, while pretending to take a long shower, I checked the prepaid burner phone hidden at the bottom of my laundry basket. I had one encrypted text message from Dana. She warned me that we had exactly 48 hours to execute the sting operation. She said Beckett's shell company was accelerating the timeline rapidly and preparing to bypass my signature entirely if I did not legally surrender the land soon. I needed to push them off balance and force their hand. I walked back into the living room, wrapping my wet hair in a towel. Marin was reorganizing my bookshelf, a deeply invasive habit that always drove me crazy. I stood quietly behind her and spoke in a soft, incredibly fragile voice. I told her that if Gideon could somehow see what she was doing right now, he would be profoundly disappointed in her. Marin flinched violently, her entire body jerking as if she had touched a live electrical wire. She dropped a heavy hardcover book onto the hardwood floor with a deafening crash. She did not turn around to face me. She just stood completely frozen, her shoulders rising and falling with rapid, erratic breaths, before she stormed out of the room without uttering a single word. That night, the house was plunged into darkness, save for the tiny, unblinking red recording lights of Beckett's new security cameras. I crept silently down the hallway, keeping my bare feet on the edges of the floorboards to avoid creaking. I pressed my back flat against the cold wall. Just inches from the closed guest room door, the wood was thin. I held my breath, straining to hear the hushed, frantic argument taking place inside. It was Marin. Her voice trembled with a terrifying mixture of raw panic and cold, calculated malice. She whispered to Beckett that they were completely running out of time. She stated clearly that the longer I delayed signing those papers, the more they had to commit to using Plan B. The glass double doors of Holloway and Pierce Legal looked impeccably authentic, complete with frosted lettering and polished brass handles. Dana Klein had spared no expense in constructing the illusion. The reception area smelled of expensive coffee and leather bindings. I walked into the main conference room precisely at 10 o'clock in the morning, playing the role of a woman entirely drained of her fight. Beckett and Marin were already seated on one side of a massive mahogany table. Beckett practically vibrated with barely contained anticipation, his sleek briefcase already unsnapped. Marin wore a soft beige cashmere sweater, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She offered me a tragic, supportive smile that made my stomach churn. Standing quietly in the corner, holding a leather-bound legal pad, was Dana. She wore thick-rimmed glasses and a conservative navy blazer. Playing the part of a silent, unassuming paralegal, she did not even look up when I pulled out my chair. Beckett immediately slid a thick stack of stapled documents across the polished wood. The crisp white pages were flagged with bright yellow sticky notes indicating exactly where I needed to press my pen. He offered me his heavy silver fountain pen, his voice practically dripping with artificial sympathy. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I folded my hands on the table and looked directly at my sister. I told them I was ready to surrender the property. I admitted I was too exhausted to fight the tax boards or deal with the endless paperwork. A flash of profound relief washed over Marin's face, but I raised a single finger to stop Beckett before he could speak. I stated that I had one final condition before I signed away my birthright. I wanted Marin, and only Marin, to explain exactly what I was giving up. I wanted her to look me in the eye and tell me the absolute truth about Harper Ridge. Beckett immediately shifted in his leather chair, trying to intercept the demand. He leaned forward, deploying a sickly sweet, incredibly condescending tone. He attempted to simplify the legal jargon, speaking to me as if I were a particularly slow child. He claimed the land was just a geological dead zone, a liability of barren rock and useless scrub brush. He said setting up the corporate trust was merely a complex administrative shield to protect my remaining assets from aggressive state tax audits. He wanted me to feel utterly overwhelmed by the terminology, hoping I would simply sign the papers to make his irritating voice stop. I let him talk for 3 uninterrupted minutes. When he finally paused to take a breath, I dropped my first match onto the dry kindling. I asked him why there was such a frantic, desperate rush to transfer ownership of a supposedly worthless piece of dirt. I tilted my head, feigning innocent confusion, and asked why a high-level broker like him was the absolute only person granted access to manage this specific, obscure holding company. The air in the room instantly thickened. Beckett's perfectly manicured fingers twitched. He opened his mouth to deliver another rehearsed lie, but Marin snapped first. Her posture went entirely rigid, the carefully constructed mask of the grieving. Supportive sibling shattered, revealing the decades of bitter resentment boiling underneath. She glared at me, her voice trembling with a toxic mixture of anger and profound jealousy. She spat out that I always needed everything explained to me because I was always the one our father blindly trusted. She leaned across the table, her eyes flashing with venom. She said I was the golden child who was handed 50 acres of prime real estate while she was tossed aside. And now she was the one forced to clean up my financial mess. It was the opening I desperately needed. She was speaking from a place of raw, unguarded emotion. I reached into my oversized leather tote bag. I bypassed the tissues and the sunglasses, wrapping my fingers around the folded piece of paper I had taken from Gideon's hidden desk. I pulled out the photocopied quitclaim deed and slowly unfolded it. I slid the paper across the polished mahogany, letting it come to rest directly in front of Marin. I pointed to the bottom of the page, where a flawless forgery of my own signature sat above a fake notary stamp. I asked Marin if she recognized the penmanship. I asked her if she had practiced the loops of my letters herself, or if Beckett had hired a professional to do the dirty work. The reaction was explosive. Beckett's face flushed a violent, ugly shade of crimson. He lunged forward and slammed his open palm down on the heavy mahogany table with a force that rattled the water glasses. He shouted that the document was completely irrelevant and inadmissible. In his blind, sudden panic, his carefully guarded filter completely evaporated. He sneered, his voice echoing off the glass walls. He shouted that it did not matter what I thought I knew, because once these new papers ran through his contact at the county clerk office, the transfer was locked, finalized, and completely bulletproof. He had just handed us the missing link. He had verbally confirmed the corrupt local official on tape. In the corner of the room, Dana shifted her weight. She did not say a word, but her thumb casually brushed the side of her leather portfolio. I knew the subtle gesture. She was activating the secondary, hardwired audio recording system hidden beneath the conference table, ensuring Beckett's explosive confession was captured with crystal-clear precision. Beckett realized his massive error a fraction of a second too late. He froze, his chest heaving, his eyes darting wildly toward the frosted glass doors as if he suddenly realized the room felt like a cage. Marin was staring at the forged signature, her face entirely drained of blood. She looked like a woman standing on the gallows, listening to the lever being pulled. I did not break eye contact with my sister. I leaned in closer, dropping the fragile widow persona entirely. My voice was steady, cold, and razor-sharp. I told her I finally understood the sudden security cameras, the confiscated car keys, and the desperate, frantic push to get my ink on the page today. I locked my eyes onto hers, watching the sheer terror rise in her pupils. I asked her if she wanted me to sign the papers so desperately because she was absolutely terrified that Gideon was actually still alive. The question hung in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the conference room like a live grenade. Marin stared at me, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The sheer terror I had witnessed just a fraction of a second ago rapidly mutated into something entirely different. The polished, supportive sibling vanished completely, replaced by a frantic, cornered woman whose internal reality was fracturing in real time. She violently shook her head, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place, slapping against her pale cheeks. She completely ignored my question about Gideon. Instead, she slammed both of her hands onto the edge of the mahogany table, launching into a desperate, aggressive defense where she positioned herself as the ultimate victim. She acted as if the courtroom was situated squarely inside her own chest, and I was the guilty party standing on trial. She spat out that I always took everything without ever having to work for it. I took all our late father's love, all his pride, and absolutely all the financial security. She practically screamed that she had spent her entire adult life picking up the miserable scraps while I paraded around in my perfect marriage with my perfect house. Completely blind to how much she suffered living constantly in my shadow. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysterical, deafening pitch. I leaned forward, resting my forearms heavily on the table, and hit her with cold, undeniable logic. I told her to stop hiding her greed behind the word love. I kept my tone incredibly flat, hammering each point into the suffocating silence of the room. I stated that forging my signature on a quitclaim deed was not an act of sisterly affection. Bribing a stranger to call my office and demand my work schedule was not an act of physical protection. Installing high-definition security cameras inside my personal living space, stealing my car keys so I could not leave the property, and monitoring my phone calls. None of that was love. It was a hostile takeover of my life, executed by the two people who were supposed to be my family. Beckett realized the catastrophic danger of this downward spiral. His slick, impenetrable corporate facade completely dissolved into raw panic. He shoved his leather chair back so violently it tipped over entirely and crashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass window. He raised both hands, his voice a sharp, commanding bark designed to regain control of a room that was slipping rapidly through his fingers. He ordered us to stop speaking right there. He loudly announced the meeting was officially over, declaring we were leaving the premises immediately. He reached blindly for his open briefcase, his hands trembling violently with suppressed rage, but the heavy dam inside Marin had already broken. The crushing weight of the complex conspiracy, the profound, festering jealousy, and the sheer shock of being caught in her own deceitful web finally shattered her completely. She did not stand up to follow him. Instead, she buried her face in her hands and burst into loud, ugly, uncontrollable sobs. Her shoulders heaved as the darkest secret they shared tore its way out of her throat. She looked up at me, her expensive mascara running down her pale cheeks in thick, dark streaks. Her voice was a ragged, wet gasp that made my blood run entirely cold. She asked me if I honestly thought the massive fire at the storage facility was just a tragic, random accident. She shook her head, her eyes wide and dangerously manic. She choked out the words that should have stayed buried under the ashes forever. She said he was supposed to die. The oxygen in the room instantly vanished. It was not a direct, legally phrased confession of murder, but it was the jagged, undeniable edge of the murder weapon resting right on the table. Beckett whipped his head around, his handsome face contorting into a horrifying mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He lunged toward Marin, grabbing her by the shoulder, and snarled at her to shut her mouth. The sheer violence in his voice was deafening. The polished broker was entirely gone. In his place stood a desperate, cornered criminal operating strictly on pure survival instinct. He knew she had just destroyed them both with a single, panicked sentence. In the far corner of the room, out of Beckett's direct line of sight, Dana Klein finally moved. She did not break her cover as the silent paralegal, but her hand slid smoothly to the waistline of her tailored skirt. Pressing a concealed button on her secure radio transmitter, she was silently signaling the tactical backup team stationed in the stairwell to prepare to breach the room. But I knew she was waiting. She needed one final, airtight sentence to legally lock Marin into the extortion and fraud conspiracy before the handcuffs came out. I kept my eyes locked on my sister. I did not let the profound horror of her words show on my face. I spoke incredibly slowly, driving the final, inescapable nails into the coffin of our relationship. I told her she knew Gideon was actively being targeted by a violent, dangerous man. I said she knew all about the fake title documents, the shell companies, and the fraudulent notary stamps. I stated clearly that she knew exactly what Beckett was capable of doing to secure that land, and she actively chose to participate anyway. Marin practically tore at her own hair, her voice rising to a deafening, hysterical scream that echoed painfully off the frosted glass walls. She screamed that she did it because if I did not completely disappear from the line of inheritance, she would never have anything of her own. It was done. The confession was absolute, recorded from 3 different angles, and entirely legally binding, but before Dana could even draw her concealed weapon or shout a verbal command to freeze, the atmosphere in the room violently snapped. Beckett realized the trap had fully closed around him and he had run out of lies. He did not raise his hands in surrender. He operated with terrifying, animalistic speed. He vaulted over the corner of the heavy mahogany table, shattering 2 water glasses, and slammed directly into my chair. His heavy hand clamped down on my forearm like a steel vise, his fingers bruising my skin instantly. He yanked me up from the chair with a brutal, bone-jarring force. He pulled my body flush against his chest, twisting my arm painfully behind my back, effectively using me as a human shield. I could smell the stale sweat and raw panic radiating off his expensive suit. He leaned down, his mouth pressing hard against my ear, his breath hot and ragged. He whispered that if I wanted to play by the rules of the law, he was going to play it an entirely different way. The heavy frosted glass doors of the conference room suddenly burst open as the state tactical team flooded the entrance, their weapons drawn, but they were exactly 1 second too late. Beckett wrenched my arm harder and dragged me backward, pulling me out into the blindingly bright hallway before a single officer could step into his path. The fluorescent lights of the corridor blurred into a sickening streak of white as Beckett dragged me backward. His fingers dug so deeply into my arm that my hand went completely numb. He practically threw me into the emergency stairwell, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind us, cutting off the shouts of the tactical team. We descended into the subterranean parking garage, the air instantly turning frigid and reeking of exhaust and damp concrete. Behind us, the frantic, echoing clatter of expensive heels announced Marin's arrival. She was hyperventilating, her face a smeared, unrecognizable mess of tears and ruined makeup, completely broken by the reality of her collapsing empire. Beckett yanked me toward a black sedan parked near the exit ramp, but he abruptly froze. The exit was entirely blocked. 2 massive, unmarked black SUVs sat diagonally across the concrete ramp, their heavy tires screeching slightly as they braked. Dana Klein stepped out from the passenger side of the lead vehicle. Her tactical vest strapped tightly over her navy blazer, her weapon drawn and aimed squarely at Beckett's chest. 4 more state investigators fanned out behind her. Completely sealing the perimeter, the subterranean garage turned into a high-pressure echo chamber. Dana's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, ordering him to release me and place his hands on the hood of the car. Beckett pulled me tighter against his chest, his rapid heartbeat slamming against my spine. In his absolute desperation, his massive ego took the wheel. He shouted back, his voice cracking with panicked arrogance. He told Dana she had absolutely no idea how many people he had in his pocket. He screamed that arresting him would rip the entire county apart, explicitly bragging that the senior recording clerk at the county office was on his direct payroll and would bury any evidence they thought they possessed. It was the exact, undeniable confirmation Dana needed to secure federal warrants for the corrupt local officials. He had just confessed to systemic bribery on a hot mic. Then, the most beautiful, chilling moment of my entire life unfolded. From the dark shadows behind the second SUV, a tall figure slowly stepped into the harsh glare of the halogen headlights. It was not a heavily armed officer, it was Gideon. He did not look like a man who had narrowly escaped a raging inferno. He was dressed in a dark, simple jacket, his hands resting casually in his pockets. He did not rush forward. He did not shout my name or play the emotional, tearful hero. He just stood there, completely still, radiating an icy, terrifying calm as he stared directly into the eyes of the man who had tried to incinerate him. Beckett's entire body went rigid. The breath hitched violently in his throat. He stared at the ghost standing 20 feet away, his jaw slacking as a single word escaped his lips. You, in that microscopic fraction of a second. The crushing pressure on my arm vanished as Beckett's brain completely short-circuited. I did not hesitate. I dropped all my body weight, twisted violently to the left, and ripped myself free from his loosened grip. I sprinted across the cold concrete, throwing myself behind the solid steel frame of the nearest SUV. Right next to Dana, the tactical team swarmed. Within 3 seconds, Beckett was slammed face first onto the filthy garage floor, his arms wrenched behind his back, the heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut. The moment the metal locked around his wrists, the polished broker vanished forever. He immediately started screaming, desperately trying to save himself by throwing my sister directly under the bus. He yelled that Marin had masterminded the forged signatures, that she was the one who desperately wanted me erased from the property deed. But his frantic betrayals were entirely useless. The audio recordings had securely locked them both inside the very cage they had built for me. They had the forged documents, the audio of their contingency plan, and the undeniable verbal admissions of their extortion. 2 officers approached Marin. She did not fight. She simply collapsed onto her knees on the concrete, her shoulders shaking violently as they read her rights. Her fate had been permanently sealed upstairs in the conference room. Her raw, jealous confession about the line of inheritance, and her sickening admission that Gideon was supposed to die, left her with absolutely zero room to negotiate a plea deal. The ensuing weeks tore their entire criminal network apart. The state investigation aggressively expanded, using Beckett's parking garage rant and the confiscated transaction data from his briefcase to completely dismantle the shell companies. The corrupt local official in the county clerk's office was arrested in his driveway just 2 days later. The trial was a swift, brutal execution of justice. Beckett received an incredibly heavy sentence, facing decades in a federal penitentiary for document fraud, conspiracy to steal assets, and first-degree arson. Marin stood completely silent in her orange jumpsuit as the judge handed down her sentence for criminal complicity, grand theft conspiracy, and being an accessory to attempted murder. The prosecution played the audio of her screaming in the conference room. The entire courtroom listened to her declare that my husband was supposed to die. I did not look back at her as the bailiffs led her away. Gideon and I finally returned to our house on a quiet Tuesday morning. The very first thing we did was take a heavy hammer to every single security camera Beckett had installed, ripping the wires out of the drywall and tossing the shattered lenses into the garbage. We sat together on the living room floor, surrounded by dust and quiet, finally taking our first real, deep breaths in what felt like a lifetime. A few months later, we took the initial profits from the first legitimate lease of Harper Ridge and established a dedicated legal defense fund. We named it the Harper Safe Title Initiative. It is designed specifically to provide aggressive legal representation for vulnerable people and elderly citizens who find themselves targeted by predatory family members and fraudulent land brokers. We turned the absolute worst nightmare of our lives into a shield for others. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If you have ever been manipulated by a relative using the word family as a weapon to get what they want, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is right now in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. Please do not forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by as many people as possible.